All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about immigration during the late 1800s, during this Gilded Age slash, progressive era that we've been covering. There was massive amounts of new immigrants coming to the United States, beginning really in the 1890s. You had 3.5 million immigrants, most of which were coming from areas that we had previously not seen immigration from. That's why we're going to call these guys the new immigrants versus the old immigrants that would be like, say, coming from Western and Northern Europe, places like Britain, why we speak English. We were the 13 original colonies and everything. Germany, remember we talked a lot about the German immigrants that came in the early 1800s. And you had, of course, the older German immigrants that founded, the Pennsylvania Dutch and all that. These new immigrants are mostly going to be coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. Now, when we say Southern Europe, we're mainly going to be talking about the country of Italy. Remember, like the boot, Italia, they like their pastas, where the Pope lives. And remember, it is where Rome is, and the Vatican and the Pope. It is a Catholic nation. Roman Catholicism is the main religion in Italy. A lot of these Italian immigrants that came over, they're speaking Italian, they are Catholic. They were seen as very different from those older immigrants or the native, Americans that are already over here. Excuse me. White Americans that are already over here, are Protestant or of a Protestant tradition from the British or the Germans. They speak English. Okay, so these Italians are going to be very different and they'll be discriminated against based on their differences, these new immigrants. Discrimination against immigrants is called nativism. Now, the other group you have coming over here in big waves of millions in the 1890s and the early 1900s, and this would be like my mother's family, are coming from Eastern Europe. And this was mainly out of the old dying empires in Eastern Europe at the time. So a lot of those that were coming from Eastern Europe were coming from the Russian Empire or were coming from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And many of these Eastern Europeans, they weren't even Christian at all. They would be Jewish. Or if they were Christian, many coming from like Russia might have been like Eastern Orthodox. So even more foreign than, say, like your Italian Catholic immigrants. And these, Eastern European, Jewish, Eastern Orthodox, immigrants that are coming over, also bringing ideas from those places that were starting to become widespread, ideas of communism, anarchism, these sorts of things. As a result of all of these different groups, American society was kind of in flux. And remember, you also have the racial tensions down in the South with African Americans at the end of Reconstruction being subjugated in new forms of oppression, such as the Jim Crow laws, sharecropping. And so American society seemed to be kind of breaking along lines of both class and race at the end of the 1800s, going into the new century, the 20th century. And the result, commented the economist Simon Patten, was a widespread obsession with redrawing the boundary of freedom by identifying and excluding those unworthy of the blessings of liberty. The South, he wrote, has its Negro, the city has its slums, the friends of American institutions fear the ignorant immigrant, and the working man dislikes the Chinese. So there's going to be a lot of prejudice all around during this time period. You can see this indicated in the political cartoon right there, right? It's a very famous one showing nativism, discrimination against immigrants. Here you have a very caricaturely drawn Eastern European immigrant. We know he's probably coming from Eastern Europe because he's Jewish. He has that big, thick beard. His features are accentuated, like the big nose is supposed to be a caricature for like Jewish people and a stereotype. And it says Sabbath desecration. Sabbath is the holy day for Jewish people. He's wearing a yarmulke on top of his head. Jewish men are supposed to wear those yarmulkes. If you are a devout, like Orthodox Jew, my family is not. We're more reform minded slash not very religious, but there are still very traditional Jews that wear those. And so this Eastern European Jewish immigrant, look at the bags that he's carrying into the United States, because this is the United States he's trying to enter. He's standing at the gate. Uncle Sam is standing in the way of him entering the country. And Uncle Sam is holding his nose like he smells something bad, like this guy stinks. And this guy's trying to carry in these bags that say poverty, disease, anarchy. I can't read the others, but desecration. This guy is trying to carry in all these troubling things that America doesn't want in its country. We need to keep these immigrants out. That is nativism. These ideas that immigrants would be bad for our country. That is nativism. uh, Between 1901 and 1914, you're going to have 13 million immigrants, and this is when my great grandfather, my great great grandfather, it's either my great grandfather, my great great grandfather, came over from they came over from Romania, and on my grandmother's side, they came over from Poland, and also had some come over from Hungary, I believe, but all from like Eastern Europe. And they're coming into the United States, these Southern and Eastern European immigrants, mainly through New York City, and through the harbor. This is where the time period you could see in this picture here from the immigrants' perspective. They could see the very first sighting of land in America. They could see that statue, the Statue of Liberty, the gift from the French, as a welcoming sign that they had reached this new land to start their new lives. And there is the inscription on the poem on the Statue of Liberty that says, give me your poor, you're tired, you're sick, your huddled masses yearning to be free. That is the welcoming sign. And then they would be taken to an island that is just kind of behind Liberty Island called Ellis Island. And this is all in excuse me, in New York Harbor, in the Hudson. And on Ellis Island, that's Ellis Island right there, their ship would dock and they'd get off and they would be processed. And by processing, I mean that they'd have their fingerprints taken. They'd be asked a series of questions like, what is your name? Let's write it down. Do you have family over here? What do you plan on doing? Where do you plan on going? They would also screen for, it's this early 1900s. Their science was kind of limited, but they would try to screen for any potential diseases or viruses that these people might be bringing in, because we don't want that entering the country, obviously. And then if they were given the go-ahead, given the A-OK, then they would be put on a train. There's a railroad track behind the big processing building there. And then the railroad bridge, they would go across on the train into New York City and begin their life as Americans. Well, not as Americans, because during this time, well, if you were non-white, it was basically impossible to become naturalized. For these Eastern and Southern European immigrants at this time, they could become naturalized, but they are immigrants and they are going to face a lot of adversity. Industrialization and decline of traditional agriculture means that this time period, we have all these factories rising up in these cities. This is the major pull factor that's bringing these immigrants over here, is that they want a job. They want to have the ability to earn a living and provide for their families, which they were not able to get over in Europe. Europe is going through many rapid, dangerous changes at this time. Like I said, as those old empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire are starting to crumble, and a lot of infighting was happening. And of course, in 1914, the Great War, World War I, will break out. And so many of these immigrants, they fled Europe to escape oppression, to escape anti-Semitism, to escape war. But for the majority, it was the pull, the promise of jobs and opportunities in the United States that brought them here. And they would get these factory jobs when they came to American cities, because they would be willing to work for far less than most Americans already over here were willing to work for. And so that leads to even more of these factories and industrialization, and all these people flocking to the cities mean that our cities are growing. This is urbanization. So industrialization and urbanization are going hand in hand at this time in the late 1800s, early 1900s. On the West Coast in California, That's this picture right here. You could see the beginning of the Golden Gate Bridge there in San Francisco Harbor, and Alcatraz Island is somewhere nearby here, where they have the famous old prison where they put the famous gangsters we'll talk about later, like Al Capone. He stayed there briefly. Um, and then Angel Island is this big immigrant processing station on the West Coast, right there in the shadow of the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco Harbor in California. That is the main place that Asian immigrants would be entering the country from. And Asian immigrants are going to be coming in fairly healthy numbers in the 1800s, but there will be restrictions later on as you saw an increase in competition for jobs, especially in California, and conditions became crowded. The country will begin to exclude certain groups of Asian immigrants from coming over, beginning with the Chinese. Um, and as these immigrants are coming into the United States, they're entering these cities looking for work, finding work, very, very cheap, low wage labor, long hours in these factory jobs. They're often in these cities congregating together, forming their own ethnic neighborhoods. So ethnicity means like your background. It means like what sort of nationality you come from. And so ethnic neighborhoods would be like Chinatown, where all of the Chinese immigrants in like the city of New York or the city of Chicago. Chicago's Chinatown is one of my favorite. That's the one I have the most experience with and love their Chinese restaurants there. But yeah, all the Chinese immigrants in these cities would flock together, and they would kind of take over like a certain part of the city. And when I say take over, I just mean like there would be a lot of Chinese immigrants living in that part of the city. They would set up a lot of their shops in that part of the city. They would set up a lot of their restaurants in that part of the city. So you have like a little cosmosphere of China inside this American city. That's what we call Chinatown. Same thing with like Little Italy. You'd have a little slice of Italy with all these Italian immigrants in one part of the city, like in New York City, for instance. Um, Side note, yeah, the Chinese restaurants that I visited in Chicago's Chinatown are amazing. They have like traditional dim sum. So if you've ever been to kind of a more traditional Chinese restaurant, they have these circular tables you all sit around, and then on the center of the table is a spinning plate, very large, circular, and you could spin it around, and you basically you order a whole bunch of like little dishes, and they're tiny, and each has like four little dumplings or something you could try. And you put them on that center wheelie and you spin it around, and each person can kind of grab their own and try out different things, and it's a wonderful experience and really, really tasty food. But that is very traditional Chinese, because it's about as close as you can get to a real Chinese restaurant without actually having to go to China, because these were recent immigrants that started these restaurants and stuff. So that is some of the stuff happening with immigrants at this time. Let's talk a little bit more about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Actually, before I get to that, one more side note. Founded in 1894 by a group of Boston professionals, you have the Immigration Restriction League. And there were other groups like this, but the main thing you need to know that they were calling for was reducing immigration. They wanted to restrict immigration. They were especially the labor unions at the time worried about all these immigrants coming over and driving wages down. Because if an immigrant is willing to work for less than an American worker, that business is going to hire the immigrants. Okay, it's no duh. So they're driving wages down. So they wanted to reduce immigration. They want to limit the number coming over. And how they proposed doing this was by barring illiterates from entering the United States, passing basically like taking a page right out of the South, out of the Jim Crow South, with those literacy tests, and applying that to these new, Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Nearly all states during the 1890s adopted also the secret or Australian ballot, meant both to protect voters' privacy and to limit the participation of illiterates. A lot of these immigrants, they would vote in the cities, like for the political machines we talked about, how they relied on the immigrant vote. They would get assistance in voting from, a friend that would come and join them, or from like a guy from the political machine would come and join them and, tell them what was on the ballot because they couldn't read. And that was fine. Well, with the new secret ballots, the new Australian ballot that's being used, they could no longer receive help from party officials at polling places. And so they wouldn't be able to vote anymore. So there were ways that groups were cracking down on immigrants before we get to this Chinese Exclusion Act. Well, I guess that the other stuff was after because it's the 1890s. But 1882, America will pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. It is the first ever major law from our government that used race to basically exclude an entire group of people from entering the United States. Congress is going to renew this restriction, keeping Chinese immigrants out of our country 10 years later in 1892, and they're going to make it permanent in 1902, at least until after relations are normalized again under Nixon, I suppose. We also are allied with the Chinese during World War II, so there's a little bit of crossover there. But yeah, this is a pretty hefty thing that we're doing, and it's almost entirely because of Chinese workers vying for jobs with whites on the West Coast in California. From 1850 to 1870, nearly all the Chinese immigrants that came over to the United States had been unattached men. They were coming over, many of them under work contracts with railroad companies, with mining companies, mining for gold, or to work in factories. And a lot of these young Chinese men that came over, they were coming over what they hoped to be temporarily to make some money and then go back to China to help their families out. But beginning in the early 1870s, Chinese families, whole families started to immigrate over. Now, that was something that was unacceptable to a lot of Americans, white Americans on the West Coast, because now they're coming permanently to stay. And that's why in 1875, Congress is actually going to exclude Chinese women from entering the country. They made other justifications for this, that Chinese women were often being taken advantage of and ending up in brothels and other things. Um, there's also a lot of racism against Chinese people for just their very, very vast differences. I mean, we talked about how new immigrants from Eastern Europe, maybe they're speaking Hebrew or something, they're Jewish, they're like, they're speaking these crazy different languages, or, Italian immigrants, they're speaking Italian and they're Catholic. And they're very different. They're being ostracized and discriminated against because of their differences. Well, imagine a Chinese immigrant speaking, Mandarin or Cantonese. How foreign that must have been for white Americans. And imagine, like, the Chinese outdoor markets, where they're selling Chinese herbal remedies, snake skins and dog meat and cat meat and this other stuff like this. They're going to be picked on because of their vast cultural differences with these more native-born Americans, but also it's just mainly it's economics. It's economics. It's about the competition for jobs. So in 1882, America will keep Chinese people from coming in. And there's going to be about 100,000 or so that are already over in the United States, and they're going to be facing a lot of discrimination. You're going to see in the I believe it's 1870s. Yeah, beginning in the 1870s, that's when like San Francisco and other major urban areas in California, they began to segregate Asian American students, especially Chinese children, in schools. And they're going to set up segregated schooling for Asian immigrants that will last until about 1947. And we'll talk about the case of Westminster versus Mendez and all of that later on when we get to the civil rights movement. But it's going to be a long time and a lot of discrimination against Chinese immigrants. You could see in this famous political cartoon right here, you have the United States, you have the Golden Gate of Liberty, probably alluding to the Golden Gate Bridge. So this is like San Francisco, California, in America. And this is a Chinese person drawn with like kind of the boxer hairstyle. He's not drawn super racistly though. He just looks like he's worn out and kind of he's like kind of like, this is ridiculous. I'm so tired. But he's just waiting out there outside the gates, not able to go in. And he's carrying with him. Remember, this immigrant in this nativist cartoon was carrying disease and poverty, and we didn't want this nasty Jewish, Eastern European man coming to America. Uncle Sam is holding his nose. This Chinese immigrant, by comparison, from this artist, is carrying with him sobriety, industry, order. These are all good things. Sobriety means, you don't drink alcohol. This is during the temperance movement is really big. People wanted to get rid of alcohol, and the Chinese person doesn't drink. Industry, he's hardworking. Order, they respect laws and stuff. So, I mean, this artist is saying this is a good person, and yet the sign says, notice, communists, nihilists, socialists, Finians, and hoodlums, welcome. You can come in, but no admittance to the Chinese man. So kind of pointing out the hypocrisy that will allow all these other dirty groups to come in, these dirty groups to come in, but not the hardworking, industrious Chinese immigrants. So that's that reading this political cartoon, analyzing it, you could say like this artist is probably kind of more in favor of Chinese immigrants and kind of against this Exclusion Act, right? All right, so next we're going to talk about consumer society at this time period and the growth of large corporations and how people were able to buy things at this time. So during the progressive era, during the late 1800s, early 1900s, because you have all of this industrialization taking place, all these factories are churning out all of these manufactured goods. We did talk about how America's wanting new markets to sell this stuff to, but we also are relying on a domestic market, consumerism among the American people to be buying the products that we're making. And so materialism is being encouraged at this time by a growing, not huge, but a growing middle class to buy these things that America was manufacturing. And of course, materialism is having, being able to buy stuff, having material things, having, little bookmarkers, and having, little pens all over the place, and having stuff you buy. And with all of this industrialization, we do have many workers starting to join labor unions. We're going to talk more about the IWW later, the Wobblies. We already have the AFL, remember the American Federation of Labor with Samuel Gompers, okay? And when we talked about older labor unions as well, like the Knights of Labor that went by the wayside in 1886 or after 1886, after the Haymarket riots. But increasingly, earning a living wage was being viewed as a right among these workers, who are also, again, fighting against having immigrants pouring in large numbers by the millions, because immigrants would be driving wages down. What workers want, what they want today in 2021, is a living wage. That means that you can make enough to live comfortably. Here are the things you need in order to be able to live comfortably. You need to be able to have enough money to buy food, 2 to 3 times a day for you and your family members. You need to have enough money you're earning in order to pay your rent or pay your property taxes, upkeep your house and your utilities. It's not just the rent, it's also paying for electricity today. It's paying for water bills, it's paying for sewage, it's paying for trash, it's paying for all of those other things as well that really add up on the cost. It's being able to pay for healthcare. If you get hurt, maybe you have insurance with your job, but still, insurance in this country today is one of the worst in the entire developed world. We have to pay huge fees on top of our insurance in order to just make sure we are being taken care of and keeping our health up. So you have to have money to afford that. You have to have money to afford an education so that you can get more money. You have to have money to afford clothing and keep up with styles, maybe not just for looks and vanity, but maybe also for your job. There are many places of work, university, high school, and McLennan Community College included, that have standards for dress code for all their employees. Teachers have a much higher standard of a professional dress code than like the students do. And you have to afford those wardrobes. um, Being able to afford transportation. If you live in the city, that means being able to afford a pass for the metro, for the subway, or like when I lived in London, the tube system, that's all the subway there. And for most Americans, since everything is so spread apart, a lot of us live in suburbs or in cities like Waco that are kind of spread. That means being able to afford a car and the upkeep of a car and all the gas. And then finally, being able to afford, this doesn't mean an allowance, the piggy bank. It means being able to save money so that you have money left over for a rainy day if an emergency should happen. If like a global pandemic were to suddenly occur, that would never happen, right? And you lost your job, would you have money to fall back on so you wouldn't be left homeless? Because as we've seen, you don't really want to rely on the federal government to vote for a stimulus and try to provide funding for you to get by during an emergency. You can't always rely on that. You got to be able to rely on yourself. And so these together constitute what we call living wage, and that is not the same thing as the minimum wage, because obviously in a lot of places in the United States today, many workers working part-time or working, those low-income jobs, those hourly wage jobs, they are not making enough to pay for all those things where their area has a very high standard of living. Like Waco, Texas, our property values are going way up, maybe because of Magnolia and all the crazy growth that's happening in like Woodway and Hewitt in that area. Every time you go out there, there's like another huge development being built, another 1,000 homes. So our property values are going up, but overall, Waco, Texas still has a pretty low, not standard of living. We live very well here, but prices are not that high here compared to how they are in other places in the country. Compare, for instance, with New York City, or even more so with like SoCal, compare with like San Diego or Los Angeles or San Francisco, any of those places in California. And you'll see that you could take a nice $100,000 house in Waco, Texas, and that same house in San Francisco would cost you $500,000 or more. That Teachers, making $40,000 in Texas, they're making like $60,000-$70,000 in Washington State, but that's still not enough for them to pay for all these things because everything else is that much more expensive over there. And so, yeah, a minimum wage is not the same thing as a living wage. And this is an idea that has been around for a long time and is something that we still don't have an answer to when it comes to figuring out how to get that for all workers all around the country. So you understand materialism, having all these things, these manufactured goods, we want to try to market and sell them to the United States. So you're going to have new forms of advertising in this time period. You're also going to have the culture of consumerism develop. And that's going to be along the lines of large downtown department stores being built in cities, neighborhood chain stores developing. Retail mail order houses are going to make available to consumers throughout the entire country all the vast array of goods now pouring from our factories. They have, Sears Roebuck at this time, Sears. You could order by mail anything that was in their catalog, like a magazine, and then it would be shipped by railroad, by train, from their department stores and from their warehouses by train to your city. And so the beginnings of, buying like we do online today, that came about at the turn of the century. Um, you also have leisure activities, things that people do for fun, taking on the characteristics of this new mass consumption society at the turn of the century. You have amusement parks that people could go to, dance halls, and theaters attracting large crowds of urban dwellers, peoples in the cities. By 1910, there were 25 million Americans per week, mostly working class city residents, that were attending what was called a Nickelodeon, a motion picture theater whose 5-cent admission charge was far lower than that of vaudeville shows. But I do have this So here's one of these department stores. You could see right here at the turn of the century. This is a vaudeville, a theater, advertising 5 cents. It's likely that they were trying to compete with the Nickelodeons, because more people were starting to attend those. That's where you actually would be in a theater watching a very short, silent picture that was in black and white, with accompanying music to it. It's kind of comedy usually, and you'd pay that 5 cent admission and get to watch those shows. But this is actually a vaudeville, is a live performance, like a variety show. And if you've ever played like Red Dead Redemption 2, it was a pretty popular game from, what was it, like a year or two ago, the sequel. They actually have you in the game able to attend a vaudeville in the made up city that's like New Orleans. And vaudeville shows, you'd have variety acts like musicians playing, you'd have, pet performances, animal performances, strange, people doing strange things like you'd see in carnival acts or circuses. And it would be like one act after another, even like stand up comedy and stuff. Um, but you can see the admission here is down to 5 cents, so it's likely that they were trying to compete with the Nickelodeons. So all of this is emerging at this time period, and this consumer society is going to be taking off, especially after World War I, going into the 1920s. It's kind of in many ways helped to shape the identity we have as Americans. If you go around the world and you ask people, their impression of an American person, it's a person who has a lot of stuff, a person who's able to have a lot of stuff, buy a lot of stuff, and enjoys a lot of stuff, and that is materialism and consumerism. All right, thank you guys so much, and I will talk to you later. Goodbye.